She walked into the lobby like she didn't belong there. No heels, no designer bag, no logo screaming for attention. Just a quiet woman in a linen blouse, cream slacks, and soft-soled shoes that made no sound on the marble. The receptionist barely looked up then, smirked. "Deliveries go through the service entrance," she said flatly. The woman didn't flinch. She just nodded, adjusted the worn leather strap of her tote, and kept walking. That tote? It wasn't Prada or Chanel. It held a notebook, a pen, and a dog-eared copy of The Wealth of Nations. No laptop, no portfolio, no LinkedIn-optimized resume cover. But her name was Miriam Langford, and everything they thought they knew about her was about to fall apart. The Langsley and Cross Financial Group was a cathedral of wealth, the kind of place where even the janitors wore blazers, gold fixtures, marble floors, and orchids flown in weekly from Kyoto. Its top-floor office suite had hosted presidents, oil magnates, and tech billionaires. And today, Miriam walked in not as a VIP, but as a supposed applicant for the role of Vice President of Global Strategy. In the waiting room, she was invisible, or so they thought. A cluster of sharply dressed candidates leaned against the curved glass walls, laughing too loud, flashing Rolexes and business school rings. Their ties were tighter than their tolerance. One of them, a man with slicked back hair and a $6,000 suit, looked her up and down like she was a stain on the sofa. "Lost?" he said, not bothering to hide the grin. "Catering's downstairs." A woman in Louboutin heels followed with a scoff. "That tote's seen better days," she said. "So has that shirt. Linen? Seriously?" The others chuckled. One of them pulled out his phone, took a photo, and whispered something about TikTok gold. Miriam said nothing. She didn't even blink. Instead, she sat quietly, crossed her legs, and opened her notebook. But that didn't stop them. Someone tossed a dollar bill near her feet. "For your next dry cleaning run," he sneered. Another one chimed in. "Is she here for admin support? Maybe HR sent her to the wrong floor." The receptionist, still watching, didn't say a word. Neither did the junior HR coordinator standing by the glass door. They just let it happen. Then came the real slap. An older man in a navy pinstripe suit walked in, holding a clipboard. "Interviewees for global strategy, follow me," he called out. "Except you, ma'am," he said, glancing at Miriam. "There's been a scheduling error." She stood anyway. "You heard me," he snapped. "We're not interviewing executive assistants today." The other candidates laughed. Phones were out. A few were filming. One even whispered, "This is going viral tonight." Miriam didn't move. She met his gaze calmly and said, "I believe my name is on your list." There was a pause, then an annoyed sigh. "Fine," he muttered, "but don't expect special treatment." He led them to a glass-walled conference room on the 43rd floor. The skyline behind it stretched endlessly, cold and perfect. Inside, the panel sat waiting 3 people dressed like ambition, sharp lines, manicured confidence, and eyes that judged before you sat down. Miriam stepped in. The air shifted. Not because of her presence, because of their perception. They glanced at each other. One of them a woman with crimson lips and an Hermes scarf leaned over and whispered something that made the others smirk. Then the questions began. Except they weren't questions. They were tests, traps, tricks meant to belittle. They asked about mergers and acquisitions, only to cut her off before she finished. They handed her a mock financial report, 50 pages then, gave her 4 minutes to analyze it. They interrupted her calmly spoken answers with, "Can you speak louder?" and "You seem unprepared." Then, in the middle of the room, they projected a slide labeled, "What not to wear to an executive interview," with an image disturbingly similar to Miriam's own outfit. Someone chuckled. Another candidate peeked in through the glass door and gave a sarcastic thumbs up. Miriam's fingers tightened around her pen, but her voice? It remained calm. She answered, she wrote, she analyzed. Even as the trap closed around her, she didn't flinch. And yet every word, every gesture from the panel screamed, "You don't belong here." She was mocked, challenged, isolated. And still, she didn't fight back. She didn't need to. Because Miriam Langford wasn't here to prove herself. She was here to test them. The air in the room grew still, but it wasn't quiet. It was charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. Miriam Langford sat, pen in hand, flipping through the impossible test they had tossed her way. 50 pages of conflicting numbers, trick questions, and deliberately misleading metrics. The kind of test no one was supposed to pass. A humiliation wrapped in a spreadsheet. And yet, she didn't hesitate. Her pen moved with precision. No scratch-outs, no scribbles, no second-guessing. The three interviewers, Daniel Creston, the Director of Strategy, Serena Holloway, the VP of Operations, and Martin Lee, Head of Recruitment, watched her with the same smug indifference you reserve for someone you're about to dismiss. But Martin was the first to falter. He narrowed his eyes, watched her formulaic movements, her ability to distill pages of data into structured notes, decision points, risk curves. She wasn't guessing, she was diagnosing. Lucky guesser, Serena whispered. Or AI, Daniel chuckled, nudging his phone toward her open notebook. But it wasn't a MacBook or tablet, just paper, pen, and a mind sharper than anything in the room. Outside the conference room, the other candidates still lingered. Jared Mason, the golden boy with a legacy banking surname, peeked in, half laughing, half curious. "She still in there?" he asked a junior associate. "Yeah," the associate said. 20 minutes now. She hasn't looked up once." Jared scoffed. Maybe she's drawing stick figures. But even he couldn't ignore how tense the room had become. Something had changed. Inside, the panel tried to reset the tone. Daniel leaned forward. "Describe your experience managing sovereign debt restructuring in volatile economies," he asked, expecting her to stutter a better, fake it. Miriam didn't blink. "In 2018, during the Southeast Asian bond crisis, I led a task force for a cross-border merger involving two national banks. We navigated sovereign risk in Indonesia, Taiwan, and Vietnam, restructured over $9 billion in exposure, and prevented a catastrophic default through parallel hedging strategies. I've attached the reports in my portfolio." Serena looked down. There was no portfolio, only her tote. Martin grabbed the next impossible task, a blind valuation pitch with no prior materials. "You have 2 minutes," he said smugly, "to tell us how you'd turn around a bleeding asset with collapsing EBITDA, hostile shareholder votes, and no brand equity." Miriam paused, then asked softly, "Public or private equity ownership?" The room paused. Serena muttered, "Private?" "Where's the debt load sitting?" Miriam continued. "Fixed or floating? And is the PE firm seeking exit or restructure?" She was asking the exact questions that real boardrooms would have scanned. She was asking them faster than any candidate that day. Daniel shifted in his chair. He tried to interrupt. "We're not here for lectures, Miss Langford." But the power had begun to tilt. Even the junior associate outside, who'd rolled her eyes at Miriam earlier, leaned closer to the glass. She watched as Serena, for the first time, hesitated before speaking. There was something in Miriam's tone that couldn't be faked. Confidence without arrogance, expertise without ego, and silence used as a scalpel. That's when it started happening. One by one, the panelists' faces changed. First Daniel, then Martin, then Serena. They began to glance at one another, searching for alignment, for reassurance. But none came. The projector still glowed faintly behind them, frozen on the humiliating slide with a red X over a stock photo of a woman in linen. It looked ridiculous now. Petty. Almost desperate. Then Martin's phone buzzed. A Slack message from an internal chat. "Who is this lady? Finance just pinged me saying her name's in the archive." Martin squinted. Daniel leaned over. "Archive?" Serena frowned. Miriam sat still, her hazel eyes locked on the numbers she was breaking down like child's play. Another message came in. From compliance. "We ran her name. You're not going to believe this." Daniel's hand twitched. He turned to Serena. "Pause the interview." "Why?" "Just do it." But before she could speak, the door to the room opened. Not with hesitation, but with authority. A young man in a crisp navy suit stepped in. No clipboard. No clipboard ever walks with that kind of confidence. It was Lucas Doyle, chief assistant to the CEO. He didn't say a word at first, just looked at Miriam, then back at the panel. And then, he nodded. The panel stiffened. Lucas cleared his throat. "Miss Langford," he said respectfully, "the CEO would like a word, if you'll come with me." Miriam stood, gathered her tote. No rush, no performance, just quiet grace. The panel rose too, but Lucas raised his hand. "No need," he asked for her alone. Miriam turned, gave a polite nod, and stepped out. The door closed. Silence fell like a guillotine. Daniel's voice cracked. "Did you just say, the CEO?" Martin's screen blinked again. Another Slack message. One line. "She's not a candidate. She's the chairwoman." The words hit the panel like a detonation. "Chairwoman?" Martin Lee's hands trembled as he read the message again. "She's not a candidate. She's the chairwoman. He looked up at Serena, whose face had drained of all color. Daniel Creston just sat there, mouth open, his expensive pen slowly slipping from his fingers and clattering onto the glass table. "Wait," Serena stammered. "That can't be right." Shesh walked in through the side entrance. "She had a tote bag," Daniel said, like that somehow negated reality. "No makeup, no heels. That shirt." Martin's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a forwarded image Miriam's profile from a confidential internal document. Miriam Langford, chairwoman of the board, Langsley and Cross, advisor to global banking reform committees. Key architect of the firm's original merit-based hiring framework. Daniel's stomach dropped. "She built the system we just violated," he whispered. Then the door opened again. But this time, it wasn't Lucas. It was Graham Vance, CEO of Langsley and Cross. He didn't bother with pleasantries. No handshakes, no greetings. He just entered the room like a judge entering the courtroom. Behind him, Miriam Langford. Still in her linen blouse, still in her cream slacks, still holding that same worn tote. But now, the weight of silence followed her in. Graham didn't look at the panel. He looked only at her. "Miriam," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. "I apologize for the delay." She nodded once. Then she turned to the three people who had just tried to humiliate her into silence. Her voice was even. "I didn't come here today to interview for a job," she said, her tone slicing through the air like a scalpel. "I came to assess whether the culture we spent a decade building has survived without compromise." She paused. Her eyes moved slowly first to Daniel, then Serena, then Martin. It hasn't. The panel was frozen. Graham Vance finally spoke, turning to the group with steel in his voice. "The board received a complaint 2 months ago about coercive hiring practices, favoritism, bribery. Miriam offered to investigate it herself, quietly. She came in," he continued, "without title, without privilege, and in a single morning you showed her everything that's broken." Daniel tried to speak, but his throat had dried up. "That slide," Miriam said softly, gesturing to the frozen projector screen, still showing the mocking image of the linen-shirted woman, was not just a petty insult, it was a symptom of a disease. "Favoring appearance over substance," she continued, "mocking what you don't recognize, and worst of all, abusing power you didn't earn." Serena opened her mouth. "Miss Lang, chairwoman, we didn't know. If someone had told us." Miriam raised a hand. Not harshly, calmly, but it was enough. "You shouldn't need to know who someone is in order to treat them with decency." Silence. Lucas stepped in and placed a tablet on the table. On the screen was a live feed of the firm's private Slack group, LX Candidates Elite. Dozens of screenshots. Mocking photos, captions like "Linen Lady Meltdown," "Tote Bag Disaster," and "Back to the Library." Jared Mason's name appeared repeatedly, his comments vile and classist. But worse, Serena's name appeared too. So did Martin's. So did Emily, the HR coordinator. Miriam looked at the room, her eyes like steady flame. "You judged me by my shirt. Now the world sees your character." Graham turned to Martin. "You're suspended, effective immediately. To be investigated for ethics violations and abuse of authority," Miriam added. Serena gasped. "Please, I didn't know." "You laughed," Miriam said. "You filmed. You condoned. You posted." Daniel stood up, fists clenched. "We've served this company for years." "And in one morning," Graham said coldly, "you've done more damage than any market downturn could." He turned to Lucas. "Security will escort them out." As the three were ushered out, murmurs rose outside the room. The other candidates, once snickering spectators, now stared through the glass, pale and wide-eyed. Jared Mason stood among them, frozen. His TikTok mocking Miriam had just hit 60,000 views. But now, it was being reshared, with her full title attached. Chairwoman, Miriam Langford. Number "You mocked the wrong woman" was trending. Inside, Miriam placed her tote on the table and pulled out a folder. "This," she said, sliding it to Graham, "contains full documentation of internal breaches, bribery trails, and pre-selected hires, including Mr. Mason, whose $250,000 donation was fast-tracked by 2 of the very people we just suspended." Graham nodded solemnly. "We'll pursue full legal review." Miriam turned to the glass wall, gazing at the skyline. "I built this system to find brilliance in overlooked places," she said. "But brilliance doesn't shine when the light is only pointed at those wearing suits." She turned back to the room. "And that ends today." The next morning, The glass tower of Langsley and Cross looked the same from the outside, but inside, everything had changed. The executive floor was silent. Desks once cluttered with gold pens and champagne flutes were now cleared. The engraved nameplates of Daniel Creston, Serena Holloway, and Martin Lee had been removed. Their inboxes were disabled. Their Slack logins deactivated. Security escorted them out quietly, but their shame was anything but silent. Across the internet, clips from the viral video now played like a courtroom record. "Ma'am, check her totesh, probably took something." "Linen lady meltdown. She's nobody." And then, the twist. "Madam Chairwoman." Each post was a hammer blow to a legacy built on image instead of integrity. But Miriam Langford didn't celebrate. She didn't tweet. She didn't gloat. She didn't give a single quote to the media. Instead, she walked into the firm's largest boardroom still, dressed in her linen blouse, her tote in hand, and addressed the entire leadership team. "This is not about embarrassment," she said quietly. "This is about restoration." Every seat was filled. Legal, compliance, HR, strategy, finance. The very people who had once ignored whispers of misconduct now leaned forward like students in a masterclass. "I entered this building anonymously," Miriam continued, "and what I experienced was not an accident, it was a culture." She tapped the tablet. Behind her, a screen lit up. The Royce Framework, Ethical Hiring and Merit Standards. "We're implementing blind applications for all positions effective immediately," she said. "No photos, no name biases, no school logos front-loaded, just skill, impact, and vision." The room stirred. "But that's not all," she said, raising a hand. "Every manager will now undergo quarterly ethics audits. Every hire must be approved by a rotating third-party panel, and candidate interviews will be reviewed randomly and permanently." A pause. Then the applause began. Slow, then rising. Because even the most polished in the room, those in custom suits with polished LinkedIn bios had, at some point, known what it felt like to be underestimated, to be overlooked for not looking the part. Miriam had just built them a shield. But outside that boardroom, the fallout was seismic. Daniel Creston faced an SEC investigation for nepotism and falsifying candidate evaluations. Serena's leaked emails exposed a pattern of rejecting qualified women over lack of polish. Martin's consulting firm crumbled overnight after sponsors pulled out, citing irreparable ethical breaches. And Jared Mason, blacklisted across 5 major firms, his Harvard MBA and family connections no longer protected him. A single phrase from Miriam's final report followed him everywhere. No amount of education can fix character. But Miriam didn't stay to watch them fall. Instead, she returned to her foundation, where she quietly launched a new global initiative, Finance for the Forgotten. Its mission? To train 10,000 women and underrepresented candidates in financial leadership, decision modeling, and ethical corporate governance. Not just to give them a seat at the table, but to teach them how to build the table themselves. She hosted the first seminar in a modest auditorium in Brooklyn. No press. No spotlight. Just a chalkboard, a room full of hungry minds, and her same tote placed beside her. A young woman no more than 20 raised her hand and asked, "Miss Langford, what made you do it? Walk into that firm, knowing they might tear you apart?" Miriam smiled gently. "They didn't know who I was," she said, "but more importantly, I never forgot." "Forgot what?" the woman asked. "What it feels like to be underestimated, to be called nobody, to be told you don't belong. I did it so that someday, when it happens to you, the world will respond differently." The room fell silent. No one filmed, no one posted. But that one moment passed from mentor to student hit deeper than any viral clip ever could. Back at Langsley and Cross, a bronze plaque was quietly installed in the lobby. It didn't show her face. It didn't list her titles. Just one line. Dignity doesn't shout, it sets the standard. The firm's new recruitment protocol was named the Langford Model and became a case study at Wharton, Harvard, and Oxford. Major firms across Europe, Asia, and the US adopted it. The Economist called it a quiet revolution in leadership ethics. Years later, at a global banking summit in Singapore, a keynote speaker paused his speech to say, "Before I begin, I just want to thank the woman who taught the world that real power wears linen." And somewhere in the crowd, Miriam Langford, seated anonymously in the 4th row, smiled. Not because she was recognized, but because the world had finally started recognizing the right things. Greatness doesn't wear a label, it doesn't scream, it walks in quietly, takes the worst you throw at it, and still leaves you changed. That's what power looks like. That's what character does. She didn't need a title. She became the standard.